You said, so you opened the door and you saw it was the police?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And he said there there will be a check. And I said, okay.
For what?
Chayce Allen, my son.
For Chayce
my
Allen?
Son. My son.
Okay.
And they asked me, where was he? And okay, I did lie. I said he was with someone, he wasn't.
Who'd you say he was with?
A lady, a friend.
A friend. Do you remember the name you told them?
Miss Robertson.
Miss Robinson?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Is such a person, or you just made that up?
I just made that up.
Okay.
He was 3 years old. 3 years old. Barely old enough to speak in full sentences. Barely old enough to tie his shoes. He had not yet learned to ride a bike or swim or read a book on his own. He would never get the chance. His name was Chayce Allen, and when investigators finally found him, he was sealed inside a laundry bag stuffed into a deep freezer in the basement of the very home where he was supposed to be safe. He had been there for months. 3 months of silence. 3 months of lies. 3 months during which the woman who should have protected him most looked investigators in the eye and told them he was fine, that he was with a friend, that everything was okay. Everything was not okay. What happened inside that home on Wyland Drive in Akron, Ohio, is the kind of story that makes you stop and think. Really? Think about the people we trust, the children we overlook, and the lies that can fill a house from floor to ceiling while the world outside keeps moving and no one ever knows. This is the story of Chayce Allen. This is the story of what was done to him and what it took for anyone to finally listen. In the spring of 2022, Akron, Ohio was doing what Midwestern cities do in late winter. It was waking up slowly. The snow was retreating. The days were getting longer. Neighborhoods like the one on Wyland Drive were carrying that familiar end-of-winter exhale, people pulling back curtains, letting a little more light in, beginning to feel something like hope. Inside the house on Wyland Drive, a woman named Azuradee France was living with her young son, Chayce Allen. Azuradee was 31 years old. She was a mother. On the outside, life appeared unremarkable. There were no obvious alarm bells, no police calls flooding in, no neighbors standing on their porches whispering about something they could not quite name. Chayce was 3 years old. He was a small child, as most 3-year-olds are. He had a condition that had taken his sight from him at a young age. He was blind. He also had other health complications, struggles that required attention, care, patience, and the kind of daily dedication that parenting a medically complex child demands. Raising any child is hard. Raising a child with significant health challenges is harder still. Anyone who has done it will tell you it requires everything you have, and then some. But Chayce had someone. He had his mother. And for a long time, or at least this is what the outside world assumed that was supposed to be enough. Neighbors remembered Chayce only vaguely. He was young, he was quiet. Some people on the street did not even know he existed. He was not a child who rode bikes in driveways or laughed loudly in the yard on summer evenings. He was a small, fragile presence inside a house that kept its curtains drawn. That is the thing about silence. It looks like nothing. It looks like privacy. It looks like just another family, just another home, just another ordinary day in an ordinary city. But sometimes silence is a warning that the world has simply not learned to hear yet. By late March of 2022, something had already happened inside that house, something that could never be undone. And for the next 2.5 months, Azuradee France did everything she could to make sure nobody found out. There is always a moment. In every case like this, investigators and psychologists will tell you there is always a moment where the story could have gone differently. A door that could have opened. A choice that could have been made differently. A point at which the truth could have come out. For Chayce Allen, that moment came on a morning in late March 2022. Azuradee France would later tell police that she woke up that morning and found her son unresponsive. She said she went to check on him and he was not breathing. She said it appeared as though he had simply passed away in the night. She described Chayce as a child who had been refusing to eat for several weeks. She said his health had been declining. She said she believed his conditions had finally overtaken him. She said a lot of things, and then she made a choice. She did not call 911. She did not call a doctor. She did not call a family member, a neighbor, a friend. She did not do any of the things that a parent is supposed to do when they find their child unresponsive. Instead, she took her son's body, she placed him in a laundry bag, and she carried him down to the basement. Then she opened the deep freezer, and she put him inside. Think about that for a moment. Think about the weight of that decision. Think about what a person must be feeling or not feeling to make that choice. To look at your child, your 3-year-old child, and decide not to call for help, not to reach out, not to scream, not to break down, to simply hide. There are two ways to understand this moment. The first is that it was the panicked, fractured decision of a person too consumed by fear to think clearly. Someone who froze, someone who made the worst possible choice in the worst possible moment. The second is harder to sit with. The second is that the choice was made deliberately. That the reason Azuradee France did not call 911 was not because she was too afraid, but because she knew that 911 would lead to questions. Questions that would reveal what had actually happened to Chayce. That second possibility is what the medical examiner would later confirm. But we are not there yet. For now, it is late March 2022. Chayce Allen is gone. His body is in a freezer in the basement, and his mother walks back upstairs into the kitchen and begins the next chapter of the lie. 2.5 months passed. That is approximately 75 days. That is 1,800 hours. During that time, Azuradee France went about her life. She answered texts. She spoke to people. She existed in the world. And beneath her feet, 2 floors down in the dark of the basement, Chayce was there. If anyone asked about him, and eventually some people did, she had an answer ready. He was with a friend. He was staying with someone. His name, she said, was Ms. Robinson, a woman who was helping care for him. Everything was fine, no need to worry. It is worth pausing here to consider what that took. Not the act itself, though, that is its own category of horror, but the daily maintenance of a lie that large. Waking up every morning knowing what was downstairs, carrying that weight through every conversation, never slipping, never breaking, never letting the mask fall even slightly. Psychologists who study child abuse and filicide, the term for when a parent kills their own child, will often describe this kind of post-act behavior as dissociation. A splitting of the self. The part that knows what happened is sealed away. The part that faces the world functions on autopilot. It is a survival mechanism that in cases like this is used not to cope with grief, but to maintain a criminal deception. For 2.5 months it worked, until it stopped. In June of 2022, someone made a call. The exact nature of that call, who placed it, and what prompted them is part of the record. But what matters is this: someone reached out to authorities and expressed concern about a child. A young child, a child named Chayce Allen. They had not seen him. They were worried. They wanted someone to check. That call initiated what police call a wellness check. 2 officers were dispatched to Wyland Drive. They knocked on the door, and the clock for Azuradee France finally ran out. The officers arrived at the house with no expectation of what they were about to find. Wellness checks are routine. They are performed dozens of times every day in cities across the country. In most cases, they end with a conversation, a confirmed sighting of the person in question, and a notation in the log. Case closed. This was not going to be that kind of wellness check. Azuradee France answered the door. She appeared calm. She was cooperative, at least on the surface. The officers explained why they were there. They asked about Chayce. They wanted to know where he was, how he was doing, whether they could see him. France told them he was with a friend. Ms. Robinson, she said. He was staying with Ms. Robinson. The officers followed up. They asked for a name, an address, a phone number, something they could use to verify. France provided what she could, but the officers were not satisfied. The details did not feel right. The explanation had the slight off-kilter quality of something constructed rather than recalled. They asked to come inside. France allowed it. The search of the home began. At some point during that search, the officers began to press harder. They told France they needed to verify that Chayce was safe. They told her that if she knew where he was now was the time to say so. They were not leaving until they had accounted for the child. And somewhere in that moment, Azuradee France stopped. She looked at the officers, and she said, "He is in the refrigerator downstairs." Not the freezer, the refrigerator. She would correct this a moment later. The deep freezer, she said, in the basement. The officers went downstairs. What they found there inside that deep freezer, sealed in a laundry bag, was the body of a small child. He was 3 years old. His name was Chayce Allen, and his mother was still upstairs. The interrogation room is one of the most psychologically loaded spaces in the American criminal justice system. It is a small room, usually a table, usually 2 chairs across from each other, a camera in the corner recording everything, and 2 people, a detective and a suspect, sitting across from each other in a silence that is never really silent at all. Everything in that room is a tool: the lighting, the weighting, the arrangement of chairs, even the way the detective holds a pen. Every detail is designed to create pressure, quiet, sustained mounting pressure, until the person across the table either breaks or doesn't. Azuradee France was brought to that room after the discovery in the basement. She was 31 years old. She had just confessed, in the most minimal sense of the word, to the presence of her son's body in a freezer. Now she was sitting across from detectives who needed to understand what had happened. And more importantly, they needed to hear it from her in her own words. The detective who conducted the interrogation was experienced. He had done this before. He knew how to ask a question that was not just a question. He knew how to let silence do the work for him. He began simply. He asked France to tell him what had happened to Chayce. She was quiet at first, then she began to talk. She described a child who had been struggling. She said Chayce had not been eating well for weeks. She described watching him grow thinner, grow weaker, grow quieter. She said she had noticed these changes and had been concerned. She said she had tried to get him to eat. She said he would not. The detective listened. He did not react. He let her talk. Then he asked, when did Chayce stop breathing? She said it was a morning in late March. She said she had gone to check on him, and he was not breathing. She said she panicked. She said she did not know what to do. The detective asked, why did you not call 911? And here is where the interrogation began to show its first fractures. France's answer was slow in coming. She talked around the question. She described feeling shocked. She described feeling afraid. She said she did not want to get in trouble. That last phrase hung in the room like smoke. She did not want to get in trouble. The detective let that sit. Then he asked the next question. Interrogation transcripts are dense documents. They are full of half sentences, corrections, contradictions, and long pauses. They do not read like novels. They read like the slow excavation of something buried, something the speaker is trying to keep underground, even as the weight of the conversation pushes it toward the surface. Azuradee France's interrogation followed this pattern precisely. She maintained throughout the session that she had not hurt Chayce. She said clearly more than once that she had not struck him. She said he had been a sick child. She said his death had been the result of his illness, his refusal to eat his deteriorating health. She used the word natural. She said his death had been natural. But she could not fully explain the timeline. There were gaps. There were moments where the story she was telling did not quite connect to the next part of the story. Small inconsistencies that individually might mean nothing. Together, they formed a shape that the detective recognized. He asked about Chayce's medical care. Had he been to a doctor recently? Had he been seen by a specialist? Were there records of his declining health visits, calls, appointments? France's answers to these questions were vague. He asked about the days leading up to the morning she found him unresponsive. What had happened? Had there been any incidents, any moments of conflict? She said no. She said everything had been calm. He asked about the laundry bag. Why had she placed Chayce in a laundry bag? Why the freezer? Why, if his death had been natural, had she not simply called for help? She returned to her earlier answer. She was afraid. She did not want to get in trouble. But the detective noticed something. In all of France's description of finding her son unresponsive, the shock, the fear, the panic, there was something missing. She never cried. She spoke about Chayce the way a person speaks about an abstract event. There was a kind of flatness to her effect, and a quality that investigators sometimes describe as rehearsed calm, the emotional register of someone who has thought through what they are going to say and practiced the telling of it until the raw feeling beneath it has been smoothed away. That did not necessarily mean she was lying about everything. Trauma presents in many ways. Shock is real. Dissociation is real. But it was noted. And it was not the only thing that was noted. Because while France was in that interrogation room, the medical examiner was beginning their work on Chayce's body. And what they were finding did not match the story being told upstairs. Physical evidence does not lie. It can be misread. It can be misinterpreted. It requires expert analysis and careful handling. But the evidence itself, the marks on a body, the fractures in bone, the patterns left by impact, does not have a motive. It does not have a story to protect. When the Summit County medical examiner conducted the autopsy on Chayce Allen, they were working under difficult conditions. The body had been in a freezer for approximately 2.5 months. The state of decomposition, combined with the effects of extended cold storage, complicated the examination. But not all evidence disappears. Some things remain. The medical examiner found evidence of severe blunt force trauma to Chayce Allen's head. This was not consistent with natural death. This was not consistent with illness or malnutrition or a body that had simply given out. This was consistent with impact, with force, with something or someone striking a small child's head with significant power. The cause of death was ruled homicide, not illness, not starvation, not the quiet, terrible surrender of a sick body to its limitations. Homicide. This finding changed everything. Every statement France had made in the interrogation room, the natural death, the weeks of not eating, the panic in the freezer, had to now be understood in the light of that finding. The story she had told was not just incomplete, it was in its most critical point of fabrication. Investigators also began working the secondary threads of the case. They pulled records. They attempted to reconstruct the timeline of Chayce's final weeks. They spoke to people who might have had contact with the family. The figure of Ms. Robinson, the friend France had initially claimed was caring for Chayce, was investigated. No credible candidate emerged who matched that description and who had any recent contact with Chayce. Phone records were examined. Security footage from the area was reviewed. The pattern of France's movements and communications in the weeks following late March was analyzed. What emerged was a picture of sustained, deliberate concealment, not the stunned paralysis of a grieving parent, not someone who had frozen in shock and could not find their way back, but someone who had made a decision, implemented it, and then maintained it day after day for more than 2 months. The case against Azuradee France was building, and it was building fast. The charges filed against Azuradee France were serious. In the immediate aftermath of Chayce's discovery and the initial investigation, prosecutors in Summit County, Ohio, moved to bring multiple counts against her. The charges reflected both the nature of what had been done to Chayce and the conduct that had followed his death. Among the charges, child endangerment, abuse of a corpse, gross abuse of a corpse, and the most severe murder. The abuse of a corpse charge alone carries significant weight in Ohio law. Placing the remains of a person, particularly a child, in circumstances that violate the basic dignity afforded to the dead is a criminal act. And placing your son in a laundry bag inside a freezer for over 2 months is about as clear a violation of that dignity as the law contemplates. But it was the homicide finding that drove the most serious charge. The legal process moved through the court system with the slow grinding machinery that criminal cases require. Hearings, motions, the examination of evidence, the construction of legal arguments on both sides, the translation of a forensic finding and an interrogation transcript into a case that could be presented to a jury. In the end, Azuradee France entered a guilty plea. She pleaded guilty to murder in the second degree. Second-degree murder under Ohio law refers to an intentional killing that does not meet the specific criteria for first-degree murder, which typically requires premeditation established in a particular legal manner. Second-degree murder is still one of the most serious charges available under the law. The sentence handed down by the court was 35 to 60 years in prison. 35 to 60 years. Chayce Allen was 3 years old. He had a whole life that was never given the chance to unfold. 35 years is more than 10 times the length of the life he was able to live. France will not be eligible for parole consideration until she has served a minimum of 35 years. Depending on how that process unfolds, she could spend the rest of her natural life behind bars. The court record is now closed. The case is resolved in the legal sense. But for the people who love Chayce Allen, and for the people who study cases like this one, trying to understand how they happen, the questions do not stop when the gavel comes down. Interrogation footage is a remarkable document. When it is captured clearly and preserved intact, it gives us something that most criminal records do not: a real-time window into the psychological state of a person who is simultaneously carrying a secret and being asked to reveal it. Azuradee France's interrogation has been reviewed by investigators and, in the years since the case, by people who study the psychology of criminal deception and parental violence. Several things stand out. The first is the initial lie. When officers arrived at the home and asked about Chayce, France did not hesitate. She had a name ready. She had a story ready. Ms. Robinson, a friend, a caretaker. The ease with which this lie was deployed suggests it was not improvised in the moment. It had been prepared. It had likely been used before, or at least rehearsed internally in the weeks since Chayce's death. This is significant. A person who is simply frightened and acting impulsively tends to fumble. They contradict themselves quickly. The lie collapses under the first layer of questioning. A person who has rehearsed and prepared is different. They are steadier, they have thought through the objections and prepared for them. The second notable element is the eventual confession. When France finally admitted that Chayce was in the basement freezer, she did not collapse. She did not dissolve into grief or horror. She stated it, she said the words, and then she waited. Behavioral analysts describe this as controlled disclosure. A person releases information at the rate and in the manner that they calculate will minimize damage. They give up the fact because they know they are about to lose it anyway, but they give it up in a way that attempts to preserve the surrounding story. France gave up the location of Chayce's body, but she held on to the narrative of natural death. This is a calculated trade. Third, and perhaps most striking, is the emotional flatness that investigators noted. There is a concept in psychology called affect constriction, a reduction in the visible emotional range a person displays. This can occur in genuinely traumatized individuals who are shutting down to survive the moment. But it can also occur in individuals who are managing what they show because what they feel underneath is not what they are presenting. Distinguishing between these two states is one of the hardest things an interrogator does. In France's case, the affect was not zero. There were moments of apparent distress. There were moments where she appeared to struggle, but they were brief and they were not associated with what you might expect. She did not appear most distressed when speaking about Chayce himself. She appeared most distressed when the questioning moved toward specific verifiable facts, toward timelines, toward the medical examiner's likely findings. The distress was not grief, it was anticipation. She knew what the autopsy was going to show, and she was trying to build a wall around it before anyone had the chance to confirm it. Fourth, the question of why. Why would a mother, any mother, harm her own child and then conceal that harm for 2.5 months? Why would someone who presumably once felt something for this small, vulnerable person make the choices that France made? There is no single answer. There never is. But researchers who study filicide have identified a range of contributing factors: extreme stress, a history of trauma, mental illness, substance use, social isolation, an absence of support systems, and critically, a collapse of the bond between parent and child. In cases involving children with significant medical needs, the stress on caregivers is documented and severe. This is not an excuse, it is a context that may help explain, though it can never justify how a person reaches a point of catastrophic failure. What the interrogation reveals ultimately is a person who was not simply hiding from the police. She was hiding from herself. She had constructed a version of events that allowed her to keep going, a version in which Chayce had simply been sick, had simply died, and in which her choices afterward, however strange, had been driven by fear rather than guilt. The medical examiner dismantled that version, and the interrogation room became the place where the distance between the story and the truth finally irreversibly collapsed. His name was Chayce Allen. He was 3 years old. He liked well. We do not know exactly what he liked. We do not have his laughter on video. We do not have a collection of his drawings pinned to a refrigerator. We do not have a dozen anecdotes from neighbors who watched him grow, or teachers who remember his curiosity, or grandparents who recall the specific way he said their name. We have a few facts. We have a court record. We have a medical examiner's report. And we have the knowledge that he was here, that he existed, that he was a real person, not a statistic, not a category in a report, not a case number. He was blind. He was small. He had health challenges that would have required patience and care and an enormous amount of love to navigate. He was in the most fundamental sense a child who needed protection, who depended on the adults in his life more completely perhaps than most children his age. He could not see. He could not advocate for himself in the way that other children might. He could not in the end call for help. He was entirely dependent on the goodwill of the person who was supposed to love him most. When we talk about cases like Chayce's, there is a temptation to move quickly past the victim, to use them as a starting point of the story, and then spend the rest of the time analyzing the perpetrator, their psychology, their choices, the failures of the system. The victim becomes almost by accident a device in someone else's narrative. We should resist that. Chayce Allen was not a device, he was a person. He had a voice, even if we never got to hear it fully develop. He had preferences and dislikes, even if we cannot catalog them. He had a capacity for joy, for frustration, for the particular fierce curiosity that 3-year-olds bring to everything they encounter. He deserved a childhood. He deserved to be 6 and then 12 and then 20. He deserved to be embarrassed at a school dance and proud at a graduation and in love for the first time and scared and hopeful and tired and alive. He deserved all the ordinary, complicated, precious things that every human life contains. He was not given those things. And so the least we can do, those of us who hear his story, is to say his name, to hold it for a moment, to not let him become just another case file. Chayce Allen, 3 years old. He mattered. He still matters. Every case like this one leaves something behind. Something beyond the verdict, beyond the sentence, beyond the legal closure that the courts provide. It leaves a question. The question is always some version of the same thing. How did no one know? How was it that a child, a vulnerable child, a child with significant medical needs, a child who was entirely dependent on the adults in his world, how was it that this child could disappear from sight for 2.5 months without any system catching it? No school raised an alarm because he was not yet school age. No doctor called authorities because there is no indication that regular medical appointments were being maintained. No neighbor knocked on the door and asked where the little boy had gone. No family member pressed hard enough to get past the story about Ms. Robinson. Chayce fell through every net. This is not a failure of any single person or any single institution. It is a systemic failure, a failure of the way we as a society build our safety structures around children, especially the youngest, most isolated, most vulnerable children. Children who are not yet in school are particularly at risk in this regard. The mandatory reporting systems, the structured daily contact with trained adults, the oversight that comes from simply being present in an institution, none of this exists for children under school age. They are to an unusual degree invisible. Their safety depends almost entirely on the quality of care provided by the adults in their immediate circle. When that circle is broken, when the caregiver is the source of harm rather than protection, there is often no backup. This is not a new problem. Advocates for child welfare have been raising it for decades. And every time a case like Chayce's reaches public attention, the conversation starts again. New protocols are proposed. Better systems are imagined. The will to do something is genuine and real. But implementation is slow. Resources are limited, and the children keep being born into circumstances where they are not yet visible to the systems designed to protect them. There are things individuals can do. If you know a family with a young child, particularly a family that appears isolated, that has minimal social support, that shows signs of stress, pay attention. A wellness check is a tool that anyone can initiate. A call to Child Protective Services is not a betrayal. It is an act of care. The person who called about Chayce in June of 2022 did not know what they would set in motion. They may not have expected to find what the officers found, but they made the call. They asked the question. Chayce had already been gone for months by then. The call came too late to save him, but it was not too late to find him, to bring him out of the dark, to say this child was here and what happened to him was wrong, and someone is going to be held accountable for it. That call mattered. The instinct to reach out mattered. It is a lesson worth carrying. There may be children in your community right now who need someone to ask a question, to make a call, to knock on a door and say, I haven't seen them in a while. Can someone check? You do not need to be certain. You do not need to have proof. You just need to be willing to say something. Because the cost of staying silent, as this case illustrates with devastating clarity, is something that cannot be measured in years or sentences or verdicts. It is measured in lives. On a morning in late March 2022, a 3-year-old boy stopped breathing. What happened after that? The laundry bag, the freezer, the months of silence, the lie about Ms. Robinson, the interrogation, the confession, the medical examiner's finding, all of it follows from that single moment in time. But here is the thing that stays with you when you sit with a case like this long enough. The moment that defined everything did not start in late March. It started long before that. It started in the accumulation of choices, stresses, failures, and silences that preceded the end. It started in the absence of support, in the presence of something dark that no one outside those walls was able to see. It started, as these things often do, in a world that was too busy, too fragmented, too reliant on the assumption that children are fine because no one is saying otherwise. Azuradee France will spend at minimum the next 35 years in a prison cell, The legal system has rendered its judgment. It has spoken with the authority that the law provides. But the legal system cannot give Chayce Allen back his life. It cannot give him the birthday he did not have, the friends he did not make, the person he did not get to become. That is the part that stays, the part that does not resolve, the part that sits at the bottom of every case like this one, quiet and heavy and permanent. Chayce Allen was 3 years old. He was blind, he was small, he was dependent on the person who should have loved him most, and he deserved better. Every child does. If this story has stirred something in you, if it has made you think of a child you know, a situation that feels off, a silence that seems too long, please listen to that instinct. You can contact the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline at 1-800-422-4453. It is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You do not have to be sure. You do not have to have answers. You just have to be willing to ask the question. Ask the question. For Chayce, for every child who needed someone to ask it and didn't have that someone. Ask it anyway.